Hello, I guess it's my turn. I'll introduce myself. My name is Nick Vincour. I'm the technology editor for Politico Europe. We're a web-based publication in Brussels in the English language, and we look at the politics and policy of power, and I pay attention to technology, which increasingly is a subject that covers just about everything, it would seem. So today I was asked to speak about the big technology battles of 2022. And I have to admit that the first thing that came to mind was sort of Transformers robots fighting in front of European monuments, in front of the Eiffel Tower and the Colosseum. But that's not the type of tech battle that I'm going to talk about today. I'm going to talk about politics, and I'm going to talk about policy, and I think the most important discussions that we should look at in the coming year. But before I get into my top five, we love to doing things as lists, as Politico. I want to spend a second on the question of why should we care? Why should we be talking about technology? We've just come out of a climate summit, had somewhat disappointing outcome, and there's a pandemic raging outside of these doors, maybe in these doors. Why technology? Well, I'd argue that technology is at least as important as those things because A, it's what allowed us to continue working through the pandemic from home and kept our economies from collapsing like they did during the plague in the 14th century. And B, technology really is at the center of the big geopolitical battles of today. The main one being the rivalry between China and the United States. And technology is really central to how Europe defines itself in this battle. How we deal with technology is going to determine whether we continue to be dominated by American and Chinese technology firms, or we develop our own European champions. It's going to define how we choose to protect our data, let it freely flow around the world, or preserve it securely here on European soil. It's going to define what we are and are not allowed to say on the internet, on your Twitter account, on your Facebook account. And it's going to define things like how we treat the delivery man who brings your Uber Eats order to your front door. I'm sure you saw a lot of him during the pandemic. And I would say, you know, many other things, last but not least, it will even define things like, will I get a single charger for my telephone? If you have an iPhone, Europe is now discussing whether we should have a single charger across all mobile phones. It's been more than a decade in the making, but 2022, stay tuned, it could happen. In any case, this is why I think it's so important and why, because technology is all around us, and it may be even more all around us if Mark Zuckerberg has his way with the metaverse. We might literally be swimming in it every second of the day. I sure hope not, but that's what the vision he's laid out. Bringing back to my list, what are the big tech battles to look at in 2022? I would argue that the first one is microchips. Might not be what you were expecting. You read about Facebook and Google and the Facebook whistleblower, but to me, microchips are the most important technological issue for Europe in the coming year, in the coming decade, maybe over the next 50 years. Why? Because microchips are in everything that we use, and simply if we lose access to them, modern society pretty much stops working. And we got a taste of this during the pandemic. We're in a global supply shortage. And if you've ordered a PlayStation 5, if you've ordered a new car, as I did in July, well, you're feeling the pinch yourself on microchips. There's an issue. Most of these are produced in Taiwan or in China or in the United States, and we simply can't get access. So I've been bringing my daughter to school in an Uber for the past 4 months because our car, which we ordered in July, is not going to be delivered until January next year. And that's because of microchips. Now, Europe has decided that it wants to build its own microchips. There's really no dispute about this question. Everybody seems to say, Of course, we need our own plants. We simply cannot go on depending on Taiwan. What happens if China invades Taiwan? Well, we're kind of sent back to the Middle Ages in a way. We simply get cut off from our supply of microchips. The argument, the battle, is really over how. What do we do? What sort of microchips? The sums of money needed to develop microchip production are enormous. Tens and tens of billions of euros, decades of investment to build up this capacity, which we simply don't have or which we lost in Europe. So there are two sides of this argument. On one side, you have a floppy-haired Frenchman, Commissioner Thierry Breton, former tech CEO, who thinks that we should shoot for the moon. We should build the most sophisticated cutting-edge microchips on the planet. Forget about Taiwan. We should build the next generation. These are microchips that will be 2 nanometers thick. For context, that's about 1/100,000th of a human hair. And they will be in smartphones, cloud computing, AI applications of the future. And he is very keen on this. The issue with building these type of microchips, building a factory that could do it, is the enormous cost involved. Governments would have to pony up billions of euros in subsidies for foreign companies, most likely in the hands of foreign companies. We spoke to the CEO of Intel just a couple months ago, and he said, well, we would expect to get about 8 billion euros from Europe if we were to come in and build this sort of cutting-edge microchip factory, which they call a fab in the business. And even if we gave him that money, we probably wouldn't see these 2 nanometer microchips for a decade. And that's being optimistic. So that's one side of the argument, the moonshot. On the other side, you have people like Thierry Breton's colleague at the European Commission, Margaret Vestager. I'm sure you've heard of her. She's the scourge of Google and other big tech companies. She has a much more restricted view where she says, well, we need to settle for good enough. And good enough means microchips that are just a little bit chunkier, a little bit thicker, 10 to 22 nanometers. And these are the type of microchips that we're missing right now. This is the reason you can't get a PlayStation. This is the reason why my car's not coming until January, because these microchips aren't around. They would be slightly quicker to produce, and we could get it going fast enough. And I'd argue, well, who's going to come out of this battle on top? I think it's Vestager, because she's got most of the tech industry behind her. But keep in mind something. France is going to be taking over the rotating presidency of the European Union early next year. And it may be a very French year in Europe if Emmanuel Macron is reelected as president of France. We may end up seeing a more French vibe around a lot of different tech files. That is the big one for me, microchips. The second one is about data. Now, this is all over the place and a little bit tricky. I'd say it boils down to this idea. How much control are we going to have over our data? How much sovereignty do we want to have over our personal information? Do we want to let it flow freely to the United States and China, or do we want to store it in a vault here in Europe? Now, this is an argument that's playing out right now. One thing to look out for is the conclusion of negotiations with the United States. Now, you may remember Edward Snowden many years ago revealed snooping by the US government. Well, Europe has never gotten over that. And we're still in the midst of this argument with the United States about whether our data is safe over there. That may come to head in coming months. We're hearing at Politico that there are proposals on the table in the US to address the European privacy concerns, to basically have a permanent sort of tribunal where Europeans could come and say, well, my data has been misused and so on. Another aspect of it is cloud storage. This is another concern that the Europeans had. They said, woke up one morning and said, hold on, the biggest cloud storage companies in the world are Amazon Web Services, Microsoft, and Google. No Europeans. Uh-oh. Does that mean that all of our data, including the data of our big industrial companies, is going to be controlled by these foreign giants? Well, yes, it is. So they came up with something called Gaia X, which is a federation of cloud services that's supposed to establish standards. It's hopelessly complicated. Well, what our reporting has shown in the past month is that Gaia X is troubled by internal divisions on what it's supposed to do. Is it supposed to be an organism that guarantees data is controlled here in Europe, or should it be a little bit all over the place? And Gaia X is also, I would say, in a way, conflicted because it has all the foreign cloud companies as its members. And this, for me, is very much a sort of microcosm of what Europe's deliberations about tech sovereignty are in the coming age, in the coming years. And one will be about data localization. Definitely the need to have data stored here, which France again is pushing very hard, and I think they will win on that. Next tech battle is about the regulation of platforms. This is one that you hear much more about in the news. Facebook, Twitter, what kind of content is allowed to proliferate. You saw the tour of the Facebook whistleblower, Frances Haugen. She came to the European Parliament just a couple weeks ago and denounced all these terrible things going on Facebook. Well, Europe has an answer to that, which it calls the Digital Services Act. And it also has another piece of platform regulation called the Digital Markets Act. And both of these things are going to be wrapped up by the end of this year, which is why I didn't put them all the way at the top. But what kind of battles can we expect here? One big battle is on targeted advertising. If you remember going back to the Cambridge Analytica scandal, the one big problem we've had with platforms ever since then is this idea, well, they send me an ad that's based on, I look this way and I have this opinion, is that quite right? Well, we've never quite gotten to an answer. Do we want to allow or to ban this practice? And right now, in European Parliament, there's a faction that says, we need to ban it. We need to say, no, absolutely not. Definitely not for political advertising. Probably not for minors. So don't use targeted advertising for minors. And probably for commercial purposes as well. And they're threatening to hold a vote in the plenary, the full session of the European Parliament, and that could go through. And it's also the key issue in the Digital Markets Act. And another question is, who is going to enforce the rules? In many ways, the answer to that is kind of, well, what are the rules going to be? Is it going to be the member states? Is it going to be Warsaw? Or is it going to be the European Commission? Now, on the Digital Markets Act, which is about the size and power of tech companies, it's going to be the European Commission. But there's a raging debate about the Digital Services Act. Could we really see the European Commission as the arbiter of opinions, of what's okay to say online? Well, again, France is pushing very hard to say, yes, we need centralized oversight of platforms through the DSA. We cannot have Dublin or Luxembourg be in charge of enforcing these rules. We went down that path once with the GDPR, and the results in many ways have been very disappointing. So that's going to be a very interesting tech battle in 2022. Another one, I think I'm on to 4 now, I'm kind of losing count, I'm going to have to go very quickly, is about artificial intelligence. In March of this year, the European Commission came out with the world's first law on artificial intelligence. very happy with itself. The world's first law on artificial intelligence was a really great thing. And I said, well, we got there first before China or the United States. And it said things like, well, we're going to be transparent about algorithms. We're going to limit surveillance. What's the big argument there? I would argue the big argument on the Artificial Intelligence Act is about facial recognition. Now, when I came into the airport at Warsaw Airport just a few hours ago, I went through an automated passport scan that looked at my face and matched my face to my documents. And this is a case of facial recognition being used for border control. Well, the question is, should we have rules about this? What if there's facial recognition simply as you're walking down the street? What if facial recognition is pretty much running all the time in the public space? Now, people like Wojciech Wiewiórowski, who's a Polish regulator in Brussels and in charge of he's the European Data Protection Supervisor, he says, folks, we should have a ban on this. We should rule it out. We should say you may not have live public facial recognition. It's the end of anonymity in the streets. But he is up against governments who say, well, okay, but we still want to be able to use it in the cases of crimes and things like that. This is going to play out in the institutional dialogue in the coming months, and my money would be on the governments who are going to have full access to facial recognition. The fifth battle I would point out to you is over gig workers. The people we relied on to bring us food during the pandemic, the people who continued to ride throughout. They have gotten a whole lot of attention, and their status has been requalified in many countries as employees. And at the end of this year, the European Commission is going to put out a law saying, well, dealing with the employment status of gig workers, which could effectively change our model. And there the question is, do we think that this is a great innovation, that these people are so flexible, they can sort of hop on the app anytime? Or do we really think we've just reinvented servitude, effectively? We just reinvented piece workers to do what people were doing back in the 17th and 18th and all the centuries before them. That is going to come into play. And there I would also say, I wouldn't expect too much because labor law is a national competency, and I don't think the Commission will go too far. Now, I'm over my time, and I'll just invite you to think about this thematically. The big question right now is sovereignty. How much is Europe going to impose itself as a power on all these questions, distinguish itself from the United States and from China on all these questions? And what is the role of France going to be? It is one of the sort of more stable founding members of the EU, and it's going to be in an interesting position in the coming year. So look at what France says on some of these issues if you want a sense of where the tech battles are going. There you go. Sorry I didn't bring any transformers to the stage. That will be next time for my multimedia presentation. Thanks so much.